Welcome back. Today we'll continue with the second of 3 units on fallacious reasoning, namely fallacies of weak induction. These fallacies occur not when the premises are logically irrelevant to the conclusion, but when the evidence contained in the premises is not strong enough to justify the conclusion. Here are the fallacies we'll study. Argument from ignorance, the so-called argumentum ad ignorantiam. Appeal to inappropriate authority, the argumentum ad verecundiam. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this. Hasty generalization, and slippery slope. Our first fallacy, the argument from ignorance, is committed when an argument's premises appeal to the lack of evidence to the contrary. Now, this is a little difficult to grasp, so let's be clear about the structure of the fallacy. It asserts that a claim is true because it has not been proven false, or that it is false because it has not been proven true. Here's an example. No one has proven that terrorists aren't hiding in the immigrant caravans, so terrorists must be hiding in them someplace. Notice the characteristic use of the absence of evidence to the contrary as proof for the conclusion. Here's another more familiar example popular with creationists. Since you can't prove God does not exist, therefore God must exist. Again, we see the use of the absence of evidence to the contrary to prove the conclusion. Here's a video explanation of the fallacy.
Have a cold, huh?
Yeah.
Too bad they'll never find a cure for the common cold.
What makes you say that?
Well, if they were going to find a cure for it, they would have by now. Why haven't they cured it yet? They have never found a cure, and they never will.
Yeah, I guess you're right. That's too bad.
Excuse me, crewman. I couldn't help overhearing.
Yes, sir?
The argument you are employing, Mr. Erickson, is not logical. In fact, it exhibits the fallacy of argumentum ad ignorantiam, also known as arguing from ignorance.
His argument seems to make sense.
That may be so, but the form of the argument is invalid. This fallacy suggests that a proposition is true simply on the basis that it has not been proved false, or that something is false simply because it has not been proven true. Clearly, just because a problem hasn't yet been solved does not mean it will never be solved. Recall that the speed of light was long held to be impossible to exceed, but then warp drive was invented.
Thank you, Mr. Spock.
Of course. I should rethink what I'm trying to say.
That would be best. Even if an argument seems to make sense, it cannot be valid unless the form is valid and that it does not exhibit one of the logical fallacies, such as argumentum ad ignorantiam, or arguing from ignorance. It's only logical.
Our next fallacy, the inappropriate appeal to authority, known in Latin as the argumentum ad verecundiam, which means appeal to respectfulness or recognition of the traditional ways of doing things, including listening to your elders. This fallacy uses premises to try to support the conclusion by citing alleged authorities who lack the expertise relevant to the claim it's being made. Here's an example. The brilliant William Jenkins, the recent Nobel Prize winner in physics, stated that the flu virus will be controlled in essentially all of its forms by the year 2050. The opinion of such a great man cannot be disregarded. The problem is that Dr. Jenkins is a physicist, not a virologist. Even though he's an authority in physics, he's not an authority in virology. He's an unqualified authority, and therefore the reasoning is an instance of the argumentum ad verecundiam. It's important to note that we often rely legitimately on the testimony of authorities, such as the expert witnesses used in courts of law. Qualified appeals to authority should satisfy these criteria. First, the authority really is an expert in the discipline in question. Second, the authority is speaking about his or her academic discipline. And third, there's a consensus among experts in the discipline in question, and the expert's testimony is consistent with the consensus. Here's David Pachman explaining in some depth the appeal to inappropriate authority.
Someone making an appeal to authority asserts that an argument, like their own argument or someone else's, is good or bad, or that a claim is true or false because an authority, or someone they're claiming is an authority, says it's true or false, or good or bad. The supposed authority could be a person, a book, an organization, or any other source of information, and this can be done in a totally proper way. Much of the time, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing this. Plenty of sources are actual qualified authorities on whatever topic, but where you run into trouble and your appeal to authority becomes fallacious is when there's good reason to think that your source is not necessarily reliable as a source of information on the topic at hand. But determining whether a source is an authority can be tricky. Different people and different audiences have different assumptions about who's reliable on which topics. Let's say we're talking about a scientific expert making a scientific assertion. Best practice in determining the reliability of a scientist's assertion about something scientific is recognizing whether his assertion agrees with the vast consensus of the scientific community. Because when we're appealing to the authority of science, we shouldn't be appealing to what one scientist thinks. It doesn't matter what they think. We're appealing to what science as an enterprise or institution has to say about the matter. That's how science works. The consensus is meant to be what we appeal to. If 3% of scientists say A and 97% of scientists say B, you can't say science tells us A. You can say that science is wrong about B and give us your own reasons for making that claim, or that science is unreliable in general, but that's a different matter altogether. Therefore, when appealing to science, your argument should sort of look like this. Premise 1, the consensus of the scientific community is Z. Premise 2, the consensus of the scientific community is the most reliable information available. Conclusion, according to the most reliable information available, Z is true. If you're rejecting the scientific community's consensus, your argument is, premise 1, the consensus of the scientific community is Z. Premise 2, the consensus of the scientific community is not reliable. Conclusion being, we have no reason to think that Z is true. Many people rejecting a scientific consensus don't even realize they're making this argument, and often don't realize that they have the burden of proving premise 2, that the scientific community is not reliable. They would have to prove that the scientific community is unreliable on many issues, and proving that is an uphill battle.
And here's Kevin Delaplante from the Critical Thinking Academy, speaking on the logical structure of the appeal to unqualified authority.
An appeal to authority says that an argument is probably good or bad, or a claim is probably true or false, because an authority says so. Every appeal to authority relies on a claim like the following. Anything, or almost anything, that authority A says about subject matter S is true, or probably true. An appeal to authority is good just in case a claim of this sort can be plausibly defended. If it's true, then you can use a claim like this as a premise, and use it to infer the truth of claims about S, the subject matter in question. On the other hand, if we don't have good reason to think the claim is true, then it's a bad appeal to authority, and guilty of a fallacy. So our planetary scientist example might look like this. Almost everything that a planetary scientist says about the conditions necessary for life to exist on a planet are probably true. James is a planetary scientist. James says that Venus is most likely too hot for life to exist. Therefore, we can conclude that Venus is most likely too hot for life to exist. Now, the conclusion follows. The logic is fine. The only question is whether that first premise that makes the authority claim is plausible or not. If we think it's plausible, then we should judge the argument to be good. If we don't, then we should judge it bad, that it's a fallacious appeal to authority. Unfortunately, there's no easy rule for judging authority claims. It rests entirely on our background knowledge. To judge this claim, we have to know something about what planetary scientists do, what their area of expertise is, how close the claim in question is to their area of expertise, and so on. In this case, my first reaction is that a planetary scientist is a very good authority on this kind of question. So, to sum up, appeals to authority rest on claims that assert that everything or almost everything that A says about S is true, or probably true. Also, judgments about the plausibility of authority claims are sensitive to differences in the experience and background of different audiences. Now let me make a final comment about appeals to authority that you might encounter if you browse other sources on fallacies. You'll commonly find people saying that certain kinds of appeals to authority are always fallacious. Probably the most common example is about the authority of claims about a commercial product coming from the lips of a paid spokesperson for the product. Many sources will tell you that you should always treat celebrity endorsements, for example, as fallacious appeals to authority, since these people are being paid for their endorsement, so they have a motive to be biased, and on top of that, they probably don't have any special expertise in the pros and cons of the product in question. For any appeal to authority, you should always be asking questions like, is the source biased? Or is there some reason to mislead? How does the source's claim compare with expert opinion on the subject? Is the claim plausible or implausible on its face? Is the source being cited correctly, or is the claim being taken out of context? You need to consider many factors when judging appeals to authority.